The Preservation Society of Newport County takes you inside the Newport Mansions.
Thank you, Bruce, and welcome back to Inside the Newport Mansions. I'm your host, Bill Tavares, sitting in today for Trudy Cox, and our guest is Theresa Soni Guzmán Stokes. She's the executive director of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, the oldest African heritage society in the United States. Hello, Theresa. Welcome.
Good morning. How are you?
I am doing well. How about yourself?
Wonderful. A beautiful snowy day.
On March 15th, the exhibition Gilded Age Newport in Color opens in the second floor galleries at Rosecliff. This exhibition explores a largely unknown but important chapter in American history in which African heritage families could unite and promote their economic and social well-being through self-reliance, entrepreneurialism, political advancement, and cultural interchange here in Newport. Theresa joins us today to discuss this exhibition. Well, I appreciate you coming out and joining us today, and really looking forward to discussing this upcoming exhibition, which I think is going to really add to so much of what we understand about Newport's history. But before you really get into the whole exhibition, I think one of the things I wanted to touch on about it was one of the things I think is striking, and you've made this point often, is that the African heritage community in Newport was really very self-reliant. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yes. And actually, for me, it's not so much self-reliance in that they were interdependent with the community around them.
Mm-hmm.
They provided, professional services to the summer residents as a means to leverage their own entrepreneurial gains and then reinvest it back into their community. And this use of the resources they were gaining and then reinvesting back into the community is what formed a lot of that self-reliance.
Yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of interchange, but also, within that African heritage community, there was an understanding that, they could do what they needed to do, and there were opportunities there to be seized, and a lot of members of that African heritage community did just that.
Absolutely. And again, I'm going to fall back on that idea of interdependence. Many times people, especially with this exhibit, when you see it shows a different type of lifestyle than people are used to seeing when
Sure.
when the African heritage community is portrayed. And because of that, they think that, it was African heritage community trying to be like their white counterparts.
Right, exactly.
And that is really not true.
Yep.
It was more about, for example, there were clubs they could not join.
Right.
And their response to that was not to say, well, what's wrong with us? Why can't you? It was more of a, we don't need it. We will form our own.
Exactly. I think that's what I was trying to get at. Is it wasn't so much that you were trying to knock down doors. It was along the lines of we're just gonna do what we do. And
They were building their own doors.
Exactly.
Yes.
It feels like Newport was sort of the right place to encourage this kind of evolution of businesses in the African heritage community. Why do you think that was?
Oh, I can tell you right now, it's not because of the Gilded Age at all.
Right,
It
sure.
is actually the history of Newport.
Yeah.
There was, Newport had a history of this sort of interdependence and self-reliance that dated back to the colonial era. I'll pick a date, November 10th, 1780. This is, as the American Revolution is ending, and a group of free Africans come together and they create their own self-help organization called the Free African Union Society.
Right, there you go.
Yeah, and that society, helped establish similar societies throughout New England, Boston, Philadelphia, and it became that Newport was an expression of Black excellence. I guess the best way to put it.
Yeah, I think that really comes through, and to your point, this had been going on for a lot longer than the Gilded Age. You
Yes.
know, this sort of, it was almost a tradition that had been established. Um, so when the Gilded Age came along and all of these, these aristocratic Americans descended on Newport, it felt like this was already well in place. The community itself.
Yes.
What Let's talk about the exhibition for a minute. There are over 150 objects. Do you have a few favorites?
I have too many favorites.
Yeah, give us a couple.
I will give you a couple. I think that for me, the ones that stand out the most are the ones that allow me to get a glimpse of what their lives were like. For example, there's a small silver jewelry box and two perfume bottles that are decorated with silver. And in my mind, I can see a woman sitting there, and I see the owner using them as she's preparing to go out for the day. It gives me a view of how um, how like us they were in many
Sure,
ways,
right,
you
right.
know, how like us, and yet, they're using these things that maybe we don't use them anymore. A lot of people don't have use for perfume bottles anymore, but I could see her sitting there and getting ready, and it allows me to remember that, regardless of what color we were, we were still the same. We were doing many of the same things.
Sure, absolutely.
So those are two that I really like, particularly since when you open the perfume bottles, you can still smell her perfume. Um, but also things that we don't think about today in terms of just daily getting around. Some of the furniture there's a red velvet covered love seat, I guess you would call it, small, like a small sofa. And yet when I see pictures of what women wore, I can't imagine why Gilded Age furniture was so small when their dresses were so big.
So it's
So,
it's it's pretty amazing.
yeah, so for me, these are the kinds of things that when you walk through the exhibit, you get that sense of these were up and coming people, for one, because you can't help but notice the amount of, whether it's silver boxes or nice furniture or the beautiful photographs that are there. So you felt that they were up and coming, but at the same time, I think you can identify with them.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think that is part of what I'm really looking forward to, is kind of delving into some of these objects and really getting a feel for what the community was like at that time. Yeah,
Mhm.
what's the date range for these objects? How far back do they go?
I know I'm not going to be exact on these dates, but it's
Sure.
approximately 1870 to about 1910. Although actually, the Gilded Age actually goes right up to World War One.
Sure.
Um, so right in those ranges.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to mention, and they're not exactly artifacts, but there are sections of this exhibit that are going to talk about the political and social activism of the time. And
Right.
there are many, in addition to the portraits, there are many news reels, and not reels isn't the right word, clippings,
Clippings. Sure.
that have been expanded that show African heritage people involved in the political life.
Right.
Now, for many of them, they still couldn't vote,
Right.
but they
Right.
were already getting ready. And it is during the Gilded Age, by the way, that they do get to vote. At least the men do. Um,
Right.
but the women, didn't leave them out. They formed, their own clubs, and it was their social activism that spurred a lot of what was going on politically.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting was sort of the bonding of different communities that were maybe being ostracized. The African heritage community teaming up with the Irish, for example. It
And
seemed
that's
like there
not a
was a lot.
story you hear anywhere else.
No, right, exactly. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah,
It
you
seemed like
know,
that was really intriguing.
it is very intriguing. And it's one of those stories that I think you'd only find in Newport.
I'm Bill Tavares, in for Trudy Cox. We're inside the Newport Mansions with our guest, Theresa Soni Guzmán Stokes. We're inside the Newport Mansions with our guest, Theresa Soni Guzmán Stokes. The exhibition Gilded Age Newport in Color opens in the second floor galleries at Rosecliff. On March 15th, the African Heritage Community teaming up with the Irish. It seemed
And that's
like
not a story you hear anywhere else.
No, right, exactly. Tell us a little bit about that, dude.
They would come together because they had common goals. And so they would work together to see those common goals come about. And that goes right up through the Door Rebellion. So it's not like it wasn't a one and done. It wasn't a one issue and we're done. They continued to work together. But a lot of that was due to who was here. And I'm going to forget his name.
That's okay.
I think it's Father Flaherty. I don't remember. But he comes and he joins forces with Reverend Van Horn, who, as you know, was the first African heritage person to sit on the school committee, and then later as a Rhode Island state representative.
Right.
So, they came together and figured out ways that they could help each other, and the two communities were able to work together.
Yeah, and that's that's a great example of, I don't want to say it's an untold story, but it's really a lesser, it's just not a really well-known story. One of, I'm sure, many that, people will discover when they visit this exhibition. I think that's it. The more you kind of look at the material that you've collected here, you start to sift through it. It's really amazing. There's just so much there. What are the challenges of pulling together so many different kinds of objects and items? I mean, how do you decide what to include? And, did you have some things that you really struggled to leave out?
We did mainly because we have so much. Unless, Chris, you want to open another mansion for us.
I know you do have a lot. It's amazing. It really is.
We do have quite a lot, but what we do, it's very difficult to decide what stays, what goes. But what we did try to do is look at each object and ask what part of the story does it tell, and how do we couple it with other objects to tell a fuller part of the story. And by doing that, we were able to, unfortunately, say, okay, this one doesn't quite match up with anything, so it stays out.
Right.
But it's that bringing things together to tell a story. For example, things like Christiana Bannister's portrait sitting above her writing desk, and telling the story of her work in the community, establishing the colored home for colored women. It's things like having the oyster jar, from which I believe that is from the Preservation Society's collection.
Yes.
And matching it with, the original portrait that we have of him, and being able to tell the story of his entrepreneurism and how he went from, an oyster house to having a hotel to having a catering business. So it's by matching those objects together, and so that they all tell a fuller story.
Yeah, it's I imagine it's got to be incredibly imposing. Here's how many objects we have room for. Pick from this endless supply of different things that could all tell part of a story.
Exactly.
Yeah. The thing too that I think is to me, when you start to really, look at some of these historic figures. I mean, you mentioned Reverend Van Horn, who was such a impact. Well, tell us a little bit about him. Like, he's one that, I think has such an interesting story, coming from. He came from New Jersey, correct?
He did. He went to what is now Princeton, and he went to seminary, and then he became the pastor of the Union Colored Congregational Church here in Newport. But delving into the community, he saw a lot of things that needed to be fixed. One of them was the integration of schools. The other was just basic civil rights, being able to travel on the same trolley as, their white counterparts, things like that. And so he became very involved first in education, and he ran for school committee and working with a number of people, including George Downing and white residents, he was voted in. He
That
became
was
very,
that was the Newport School Board in 1885.
yes, yes. And so it wasn't long that people began to understand that this was someone they could respect and that they could go to, that he then gets voted into serving in the Rhode Island legislature. Now, where he
Which
becomes a national figure is that finally President McKinley appoints him general consul to the Danish West Indies during the Spanish-American War.
it's amazing. Amazing. And there are so many figures like this that you're highlighting that have significant stories and also have ties to Newport. I think the more you start to go through some of these biographies, you start to realize how impactful so many of these people were, not just in Newport, but, as you just explained, regionally and then nationally.
Yes.
And you have looking at some of the photos, you have some, some of these photos are over 100 years old, but the images are really pretty. They stand out. The figures jump out at you from these photos. How important do you think it is to have these images available with the biographical, information?
Well, I think it's extremely important. When all you have is the biographical information, you really have no concept of who the person was because you can't see them.
Right.
And that's something that, a lot of people don't realize just how important photography was at that time. Because you got to remember, this is a time when taking pictures became more and more affordable to the average American. So it wasn't
Great
just
point.
African heritage people. Everyone was getting their photograph taken. But for the African heritage community, it was a little bit different. You have to remember Frederick Douglass. He saw this as a means of presenting the dignity of African heritage people in realistic settings. And in fact, I remember the thing he said about it was, the humbled servant girl whose income is but a few shillings per week may now possess a more perfect likeness of herself than noble ladies and court royalty.
Yeah, I
Um,
read that. That's wonderful. That's such a wonderful summation.
It is, and you'll see examples of that when you go through the exhibit. But also, photographs for African heritage people were a way of reclaiming their identity, because newspapers and magazines at that time were often cruel in the way they represented people of color.
Sure.
They showed them as almost animalistic. They showed them as being unable to speak properly. Many of these things that
Right.
they did through caricatures. And so for African heritage people, this was a way to reclaim their identity and their dignity through photography so that they could show who they really were.
Yeah, and I think it really gives you a sense. And again, to your point, it's not just the African heritage community; it's also, Irish, Italian, and everybody. But it really gives you a sense of who these people were when you see these portraits, especially a lot of these, these figures that we're talking about. It really does give you a sense of. I don't know. I think sometimes some of these photos, you really get an impression of the weight of their character. That you see some of these, you see some of like Mary Dickerson. She's almost staring out at you. Like, you can almost
Yes.
feel her. You can almost feel her saying, "Yeah, that's me." Where did some of these? How hard was it to track down a lot of these photos? I'm sure there was a process for a lot of these photos that you've acquired.
Oh, most of these photos are in our collections. And I've got my mentor, Dr. Rowena Stewart, when she founded the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, she had such an interesting story to tell that, she went house to house and
Oh, that's amazing.
basically went to African heritage people and was like, what's in your attic? What do you have in boxes? I need to see what you've got. And collected so much. I mean, my mother-in-law, recently passed, but she would always tell me the story of how Rowena kind of stormed into the house and said, you have this and you have this, and I need a copy of that. And, just,
That's a lot. And that's what it took, isn't it?
yes, that was the birth of the Black Heritage Society. This is in the 70s. Certainly there was that period of Afrocentric pride. And so she felt it was necessary to collect the history while it was still attainable.
Sure.
We have become increasingly a throwaway society. And now with cell phone cameras and all of that, we don't really think about it. And, we don't think about the fact that there might be 1,000 images of one person, depending on how into selfies they are.
Right. Yeah.
But for this time, for the Gilded Age time period, you had to save a little bit of coin, go and get dressed up, go to a studio, be manipulated into a chair to sit and have your photo taken. It was a big deal. And so Rowena just felt, before those things deteriorated and before we lost everything, she just started having to collect it all.
How long would you say she spent really, digging things out of other people's attics? Because it's it couldn't have been something that, it had to have been something that required years of work.
Oh, it did.
The exhibition Gilded Age Newport in Color opens in the second floor galleries at Rosecliff on March 15th. I'm Bill Tavares, in for Trudy Cox today, and we're inside the Newport Mansions. I'm Bill Tavares, in for Trudy Cox. We're inside the Newport Mansions with our guest, Theresa Soni Guzmán Stokes.
My mentor, Dr. Rowena Stewart, she was working here early 70s, like 71, 72. A lot of people don't know the Black Heritage Society started in the basement of the AME Church.
I didn't know that.
Yes, they put up kind of a basic Black history exhibit, and it kind of grew from there. And she was already collecting at that point. And it wasn't until 1975 that she felt she had enough. And then with the help of Fred Williamson and Al Plyberg, she incorporated the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. But she never stopped collecting. She was still collecting, and we're still collecting to this day.
Do you get to the point now where people call you and tell you they have things that you might be interested in, as opposed to having to knock on someone's door?
Oh, absolutely. We do. We have, I'll tell you, one of the most recent ones, we had a letter from a woman who lives in California whose grandfather came from Newport, and apparently her parents then moved to California. And she had, after he passed away, a lot of boxes were left with her of his papers and photographs and things that he collected. And so she contacted us and was like, well, would you like to see this? And well, of course, he was from Newport. And when we got them, it was wonderful because it turned out he had been in the Navy. And so there was beautiful pictures of him in uniform with his buddies, just, things like, today we wouldn't think anything of seeing black and white sailors together, but, this is her grandfather. And, we were so grateful for that. But we often get things like that.
And do you have, I imagine your storage plan has grown.
Yes. Yes.
How much space do you have now dedicated to storage for what's donated?
Well, we're in a building on the campus of a Rhode Island college.
Okay.
And we have approximately 10,000 square feet. And
okay.
the bulk of that is archives.
So if somebody wants to reach out with something, while I'm thinking of this, if somebody wanted to reach out because they thought they had something you would be interested in, what would be the best way to do that?
Go onto the website. We're at Rhode Island. It's ribblackheritage.org. And, you can contact us directly through there. All our contact info is there. But, always it's a process of people recognizing they don't have the capabilities for long-term preservation of these artifacts.
Sure.
That usually leads them to calling us. And sometimes it's downsizing.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about that for ourselves, right? As a family,
yes.
Start to downsize, and what do you want to keep and what don't you want to keep?
Exactly. And you have, children grow up, they leave the house, now all of a sudden you have a big house. It's like, well, we're going to downsize, but the kids aren't perhaps able or willing to take on all this stuff you've stored.
Right, exactly.
I know my poor kids would die if I told them they had to take everything out of the house.
I know. Everybody, I think, goes to a certain point where they go into their cellar and have to start trying to figure out, all right, what of all the things that you've been keeping, that everything is precious or is not so precious,
And it's determining what is precious.
Exactly.
We have it's really wonderful. It's deteriorating rapidly, which is why we're rushing to preserve it. But it's a scrapbook of newspaper clippings that a family member just cut everything out having to do with the African heritage community. So, and this is just prior to and during World War I. And so they cut all these newspaper clippings and they pasted it into this scrapbook. Now, a lot of people would say, well, we can get that on newspapers.com, and they would just toss it.
Sure.
What we discovered is that these were newspapers that have not been digitized and, to anyone's knowledge, no longer exist.
See, so there you go. I mean, that's a great example of why you need to keep things, because the assumption that you're going to just be able to get it online is often flawed.
Yes, and there's also things like, I mean, today we're not going to save our Dunkin' Donuts receipts,
Right.
but in the Gilded Age, there were people who saved the business cards of all the businesses that were here, and that gave us an insight to all the businesses that were on Bellevue Avenue.
That's right. Well, that's invaluable, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
was that the Hilltoppers?
We call them the Hilltoppers,
The
yes.
Hilltoppers, yes.
We call them the Hilltoppers because they were there at the top of the hill in an area that today we would never have thought was an African heritage community.
Right, which is amazing, right? And that I remember you talking about that before, and again, it's the kind of thing that, well, that's what this exhibition, that's what this exhibition is about.
Mhm.
I'd like to speak to you about some of these people that we're talking about, or hinting at, because I think, there are some people that are just, you really jump out. Let's talk about Dr. Harriet Rice. I mean, what a remarkable woman. And a Rogers graduate, by the way,
Yes.
1882.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
tell us a little bit about her.
Well, and getting back to photography, it should be known that there's no real photographs of her. The only one we were able to find was her passport photo.
Unbelievable.
And it gives you it's interesting. She is in her passport photo in a full fur coat with a big fur hat. And it's all quite dark.
Right.
So, but you see this very serious expression on her face. And, I can see her, and she was a remarkable woman. Um, as you can tell, she's one of my favorite subjects.
Yes.
Not only was she a graduate of Rogers High School, she was the first African heritage graduate of Wellesley.
That's right.
And then became a medical doctor.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
She is. And her work in France is inspiring because she didn't let anyone stop her from doing what she felt was right.
Right.
She'd attained her medical degree. World War I broke out in France, and she goes to the Red Cross and says, I want to help. And they said no.
Yeah, right.
Because she was colored and she was a woman.
Right, sure.
So what did she do? She didn't sit down and cry and, oh, nobody wants me. She walked into the French embassy and said, I'm a doctor and I can help. And they were like, we'll take anybody because we need all the doctors we can get right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
But she stayed for the entirety of the war there.
Yeah, and basically, it's almost kind of embarrassing when you think about what she was able to accomplish over there after she was, basically sent away here.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Another intriguing figure that will be highlighted in this exhibition, Dr. Marcus Wheatland, the first known African heritage physician to live and practice in Newport. And, this gentleman was also a real pioneer of using x-rays as a diagnostic tool. Tell us a little bit about him.
And another medical doctor, I'll tell you that African heritage people of the Gilded Age, they really achieved a lot in the medical sciences. And he is a great example of that. X-rays were still fairly new, and people weren't really sure how they were going to be using them. But he advocated for them as a use as a diagnostic tool. And it was because of that that he became known as the doctor to the swells.
I love it. That's a great story too.
Yes, it is. And it was all because of, I believe, a broken arm. A wealthy gentleman brought his child that had fallen from a horse, and he was able to use the X-ray to show how it was broken so that he could set it properly.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then again, like I think one of the things that comes through when you start to look at a lot of these bios of these different individuals that you're highlighting is that Newport has an amazing history. Just a lot of significant people that came through Newport or lived here in Newport outside of the people that we normally associate with Newport in the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts and the Berwins and everybody else. Another person that you highlight, she was valedictorian of her class at Rogers High School in 1877. Josephine, is it Salone Yates? Is that how you pronounce her middle name?
I don't know, and being that I speak both English and Spanish, I am always confused. Do I say Ceylon or Ceylon?
Right. Well, so I wasn't even close. But she went on to have a really incredible academic career.
She did. She was an amazing woman. But also I need to remind people that a lot of what happened with her in many ways was because she came to Newport. She came here young to live with an aunt after, moving around a lot with her family. They sent her here to Newport, and she ended up going to grammar school and, as you mentioned, high school here. And during the time that she's here, that is when Dr. Van Horn shows up, the Reverend Van Horn. I always have to distinguish between medical doctor and religious doctor. But, Reverend Van Horn comes. He's at the Union Color Congregational Church, which, many, if not all of them, attended. And he's doing all this stuff about the integration of schools, about, civil rights for African heritage people. At the same time that she's graduating from high school, Mary Dickerson is here and starts the Newport Women's Leagues and the National Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. Interestingly enough, Josephine, yes, she had a wonderful academic career. She was a known writer, but what few people know is that she was the founder of the Women's League of Kansas City, and she was the first president.
Amazing.
So she took what she had learned in Newport and the influences she had in Newport, carried them with her on her career.
Yeah, and since you mentioned Mary Dickerson, let's talk about her for a minute. I know that she's one of your favorites, not just for what she did politically and organizationally, but her dressmaking establishment at 5 Travers Block on Bellevue was frequented by it was the place to have dresses made for a long time, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. I mean, she was making dresses right up until 1910 or so.
Amazing.
And she came here in 1872. But she was one of those early people to recognize what was happening on Bellevue Avenue. I mean, their arrival predates many of the mansions we know today.
Sure.
But she saw the activity and what was going on. Travers Block had just been built, and so she opens her dressmaking shop there, knowing that that's going to become a highlight, for that area. And it wasn't just her. All along that block and across what we now know as Memorial Boulevard, that was all African heritage businesses.
Right.
And they were all providing services to that resort community.
And it seemed like that sort of what she was able to do there with establishing her dressmaking business really went a long way to sort of encouraging what you talk about, the cultural interchange. A lot of, upper middle class or rich white um, people like like Alva and the Vanderbilts and so many of the other um, aristocrats were able to, was spent a lot of time in there, or it seemed to really kind of encourage that, that interchange that you talk about. People started to kind of build bridges a little bit.
Well, and I don't know how far into that I would get. Certainly, I talk about the interdependence. The wealthy elite were dependent on this community for dressmaking, for transportation services, for catering, and all the things that go with being part of a resort community. But you can't be in contact with another group of people on an almost daily basis without it changing you in some form or fashion.
Exactly.
And I think that, for the African heritage community, the important part of it was, as my husband Keith likes to say, I don't want to be a part of your club. I just want your money. I want to work. I want to make this money, because then I can turn around and better my community.
Sure.
But at the same time, because of the fact that they are in this sort of interdependent relationship, people like Alva Vanderbilt, who, as I'm sure we have a flyer of a concert that she put on, which I believe was to support the suffragette movement. And she brings in an African heritage soprano as the performance.
That's right. Right.
So, there's this back and forth that ultimately has to change you in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I'm getting at is, it wasn't like overnight everything got better, but it just it was Abby Mitchell, right, who was the soprano.
Yes.
Yeah, and it had to have opened some eyes, on both sides, I guess, but more so on the side of, the white Americans, interacting and having the opportunity to kind of just build bridges between social groups.
Yes, I think that what it does is it may not open a door, but it cracks it open a little that you can peek through.
Sure,
and you
exactly.
start to get an idea. And of course, over time, you would hope that the door opens wider, because at some point they had to each recognize, this is another human being, and
Exactly.
that I'm dealing with. And Mary Dickerson, she's a good example of that, because, she's making these dresses that, women are wearing to their balls, to promenade along the park, and all of that. But at the same time, she's taking the money she's making from that, and she's creating things like the Women's League of Newport and the National Federation of Women's Clubs. There's a photograph, and I believe it is in the exhibit. I think we decided it was an important one. The Women's League of Newport, besides activate their activism on anti-lynching laws and things like that, recognize the daily lives of their community needed to be better. And one of the issues that was an issue then and is still an issue today is childcare. Now, the difference is now it's illegal to leave your 5-year-old to take care of your 6-month-old at home. Back then, it was common practice because there was no one. And so there's a photograph. They started a childcare, like a daycare. And there's a photograph of all the children standing on the steps of the Women's League's offices.
That's so interesting.
But that again goes back to the idea of self-reliance and taking care of themselves and the needs of their communities. And that's what many of these people were doing. A number of them became wealthy in their own right. I mean, Mary Dickerson owned over 7 properties in Newport. She was running boarding houses. She was doing all kinds of things. But she took that money and turned around and put it back into her community.
Right. What do you think? What do you hope people who visit this exhibition? What do you hope they'll take away from it?
I think that probably the most important thing would be, and I'll say it as a quote, it's about Black excellence, but it's that history should not teach us to be bitter, but better.
Right, right.
And if they take that away, then we've accomplished our work.
Sure. I think I think there is so much here that, anyone who lives in Newport and is interested in its history is going to find a lot here that will be very. I don't know if it'll be if you live in Newport and you know Newport, you probably are aware of some of this history,
Mhm.
but I think when you start to just look at the sheer tonnage of significant figures that you're highlighting in this exhibition, and then all of the objects, there's a lot. There's a lot here.
There is. I mean, I've heard over the years as we've been working that this history's been forgotten or it's been hidden. It hasn't. It hasn't been at all. It's just that it hasn't been widely known. And sometimes we say, oh, we've been doing this work for 40 years, and so everybody in Newport should know it. Well, Newport, like any other city in the United States, is one of constant change. Not
Sure.
only in our environment, but changing the people who are living here. And so this is why our work is a constant thing and why we have to keep on doing it. Because, not everyone knows. Or maybe you grew up here, but you maybe weren't moving in the same areas where this history was being told. So it's up to us to keep telling the stories.
Right, and to keep collecting those historical pieces and the clips and the other information from families as they sort of start to divest and maybe downsize a little bit in what they have. Do you
Well, and
think?
not only that, we're talking about the Gilded Age as history. In 50 years, they're going to be talking about us as history.
Exactly. Well, no, it's
So
absolutely true. No, it's
history's
true. It's
an
scary.
always evolving thing.
Right. I mean, you think about how in 1970 was 53 years ago. You were talking about when the collection of this material started.
Yes,
It's
the official birth date of the organization is next year. Will be 50 years.
amazing. You think
And
about
and
what was going on 50 years before that organization was founded. That would have been seemed
yes.
like primordial times.
And the interesting thing is that when I first started working and doing this research, what was considered history then has changed. So we couldn't talk a lot about private matters or things that were going on in World War II 40 years ago because they had not opened up a lot of the records.
Right.
But now it is. And in another 50 years, now we've got, the 90s and the 2000s. And
I know. I know. It's crazy. Well, I can't wait for this exhibition to open to the public. It will be included in the price of admission to Rosecliff. It'll be on the
Mhm.
second floor, in the second floor space. I know that a lot of this material is being organized right now, and the layout is being organized. So we're looking forward. We're really looking forward to it. And Theresa, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great discussion.
Guest Theresa Soni Guzmán Stokes. The exhibition Gilded Age Newport in Color opens in the second floor galleries at Rosecliff. On March 15th, I'm Bill Tavares, in for Trudy Cox, and we're inside the Newport Mansions.